Okay, we're in video number 8 now in the Joseph Jackson series, having to do with his undercover mission to discover what Joseph Smith and the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were up to in Nauvoo. And he's found out a lot. And it was mostly Joseph and the apostles and a few other people in his Council of 50 and the Danites. Most of the people had no idea what was going on with the spiritual wife system, etc. They thought he lived the morals that he preached, but it was a completely different story for some of the people at the top. Now, William Law was first or second counselor in the first presidency, and he had no idea until about the last video here. So, Mormon Truth Video Library, MTV Library, on the Dodger Game channel. Let's get into it. Start reading again, number 8. And so, in the last video, we had just seen that Joseph Smith called a bunch of people all together, basically all the Danites that were in the extra police system, the 40 men that they kept 20 on call all at one time, or on duty at one time, were all Danites. They used as an assassination squad, and they were on pay, it says. So he asked them and cried persecution and asked them if he was involved with any plot against William Law, and they all acted like they'd never heard of such a thing. And he said that was something that he used to do. Well, you know, we've seen that. He did the same thing with the when he was accused of polygamy and polyandry and spiritual wifeism, any of those things. And he got all kinds of people to sign a statement saying that they knew he didn't do it. And some of them were his secret spiritual wives, including Eliza Snow, who the church calls in whatever Family Search, is one of his wives. So, yeah, strategy that he used successfully, and apparently other people, it's corroborated. In other words, these people are corroborating each other's stories. And some of them were very faithful to Joseph Smith. Joseph Jackson was not his pal, but his story seems to be corroborated by people like John D. Lee and Sarah Pratt and other people. Okay, so anyway, here we go. This is a part of Joe's game. Whenever he is accused of secret plots, he calls his men, who are instructed to appear as foolish as possible, to disprove the accusation. In this instance, they endeavored so hard to appear silly that a sensible man might have detected the trick. But the faithful were convinced that Joe had been vilely persecuted and slandered, and that there was no ground whatever for the accusation against him. Joe, after having proved himself innocent by his accomplices, turned on the old man Norton, and called him all manner of vile names, told him his tongue ought to be pulled out by the roots, and said he, "Damn you, if you ever give vent to such another rumor, without more cause, I will order you cut up and fed to the catfish." Sounds very saintly of him. This was in presence of the city council and a large number of spectators. The poor old fellow, who was a true Mormon and an honest man, really, thought that the indignation of heaven was let loose upon him, and he looked the very image of penitence and submission. After delivering himself of his rage on the old man, Joe turned to the city council and declared that he was Law's warmest friend, and so completely did he spread the deceit on them that the Laws were induced to keep what they had passed between them and Joe to themselves. And to the world everything appeared fair. Law did not show that I had any knowledge of what passed until I gave him a hint of his danger, and then disclosed what I knew of the affair that had transpired between him and Joe. From that day we had a perfect understanding. To prevent an interruption of my narrative, I have omitted an interview that I had with Joe and Hiram the time the plan to assassinate Law was first concocted. Previous to Joe having settled upon any particular plan for the removal of Law, he sent for Hiram to counsel with him. We all three took a walk down the riverbank, and Joe made known to Hiram that he had told me the whole plot against Law's life, which appeared to please him. But he opposed Joe's plan of assassination and stated that Law was if law was cut off in this manner, it would bring the whole Gentile world down on them. He then suggested what he called a better plan of operation, which was to win Law's friendship by appearing sorry and apologizing for what had happened, and then invite him to a party where they could easily put a white powder in his tea. Joe thought a few moments on the plan and said that Emma would be in the way, and she would not suffer it. Hiram met this objection by saying that he would get his wife to call off Emma's attention, and then Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Durfee would go up to do up the business. Law would be taken suddenly ill, they would be called to lay hands on him, and no one would suspect the cause of his death. This course he deemed much safer than Joe's, because by his plan there would be suspicion and trouble. Joe said he would take the evening to think on it. Soon after we arrived at the Nauvoo house, and Joe went home. Hiram and myself proceeded alone to Joe's store. When we arrived there, I proposed to walk back of the store to the river, being desirous to get something further out of Hiram. I then asked him some questions about Mrs. Thompson, whether she could be trusted, etc. I told him that I did not want her acquaintance unless she was one of the secret women. He replied that I need have no fears of her, for he would trust her with his life. Said he, if I were to tell her to put on my men's clothes and set Law's mill on fire, she would do it. Oh my goodness. She is a captain. I then remarked that I had heard that she was one of his spiritual wives, and now I did not doubt it. Said he, who told you? I replied that the prophet told me, not only of her, but of nearly all their secret women, and it was right that he did, for they might be of service to me in carrying their measures. Yes, said he, I have slept between her and my wife. My God, said I, how did you keep them from quarreling? Oh, said he, they are sisters, and that is not all. They are one in Christ Jesus. He then went on to give me a history of his feats with his spiritual wives, but for reasons above mentioned, I will withhold names. There are women, however, who should be exposed, such as Mrs. Durfee. Taking her own confession and Joe's stories is correct, there is not, I believe, such another perfect fiend in human shape on the earth. A more devout, pious, and virtuous being than she apparently is cannot be found in any church, but a more perfect specimen of knavery, villainy, and everything that is detestable in humanity than she in reality is, the union cannot produce. A stranger who visits Nauvoo can form no idea of the corruption practiced in the city. To him, everything appears perfectly quiet and harmonious, and he is favorably impressed. Incidentally, Sarah Pratt, wife of Orson Pratt, did mention names such as, I believe, Mrs. Durfee as being involved with plots where they told young girls of visions that they had had. They were to be Joe Smith's spiritual wife. And then he would come along and said he had the same vision or something of that nature. So, once again, different people, very similar story, same guilty parties that they're naming. Okay, and hence, to him, everything appears perfectly quiet, and and sets down all the and he is favorably impressed, and hence sets down all that he hears against the Mormons. So that looks all nice, just like Temple Square in Salt Lake, right? It is originating in religious intolerance, would be any rumors against the saints. Nay, a man may live for years in this place and know but little of its iniquity. So completely does Joe cover up his crime. Many who were disposed to tell what they knew were deterred, and are still deterred by the fear of the power of Joe and the secret clan about him. When anything of a disgraceful character is disclosed, Joe, ever ready to prove a negative, will bring together his clan and prove himself perfectly innocent. And thus, no matter how vile his conduct in private, the individual who ventures to disclose it not only runs the risk of his life, but has little hope of making the people believe his story. Joe's conduct with the women of Nauvoo surpasses everything in blackness that I ever heard or read of. I have from his own mouth and from the mouth of his victims statements which I dare not reveal, for the world will not believe that such corruption could possibly exist. Yet if protection could be afforded to some of those females who were the victims of these wretches, the leaders in Nauvoo, I could, I believe, from their own mouths procure confessions that would startle the world. I have visited frequently those women whom Joe supported for the gratification of his lust. I have found them subsisting on the coarsest food and not daring to utter a word of complaint, for they feared Joe Smith more than they did their God. I have appealed to the finer feelings of their nature and seen them weep as children when dwelling on the degraded state to which their credulity had reduced them. Knowing me to be in the confidence of Joe, they hesitated not to unfold their griefs to me, but their neighbors and acquaintances generally knew nothing of their feelings or their degradation. These remarks apply only to a portion of the spiritual wives, for there are many who are as corrupt as Joe himself. From my knowledge of the spiritual wife system, I should think that the number of secret women in Nauvoo cannot be much less than 600. There are many married and as well as single women in this number, and so slyly do they carry on their operations that the husbands of many have never mistrusted the fact. Occasionally a matter of this kind was detected that opened the eyes of a few persons, and so conspicuous were things made to appear the early part of this spring that every man in the city who was not so blinded by fanaticism as to doubt the evidence of his own senses could have seen what damnable iniquity was practiced. In consequence of the discoveries then made by the two laws, Dr. Foster and others, and the exposure that followed, many of the most intelligent and respectable of the church dissented, denounced Joe as a fallen prophet, and formed a new society. But to return to my conversation with Hiram, having given me his experience in the spiritual wife system, he urged me to take a few women, and named 2 or 3 whom he said would suit me. I thanked him, and said I had no desire to form any connection with any women in this city. But if I should change my mind, I would give his choice the preference in part. As we returned to the store, we met Dr. Richards, and Hiram said to him that he would prophesy on my head that I would soon come into the church and become a great man as ever Paul was. To this I made but little reply, and left them together. I went down to Joe's house, and on entering I found Joe in conversation with Emma, who was weeping bitterly. I asked Joe if he was engaged. He replied by telling me to walk into his council room and he would be there presently. Well, we'll continue with the next video. It's a little different from what we hear in Sunday school, huh? Well, if you're LDS and you're listening to these sequentially, which is really the only logical way to listen to them, since it is a story, basically, although there are parts you can pick up, it really helps to do it sequentially. If you've gotten this far, well, that's interesting, because a lot of people in the church would just say, hey, there's, this just sounds too far from what I've been told. So perhaps you're just blowing it off, or perhaps you realize there's something to this, or perhaps you've got things on the shelf and you realize there are big holes in the story. If you don't, and you're saying, well, I'm just, blow this stuff off, in the Mormon Truth video library, in my channel, there are a lot of videos on various subjects where things are documented, cataloged. I'm not saying it's super organized. I'm saying cataloged as far as documenting where the brethren say one thing but the scriptures say another. In other words, they're denying and disavowing doctrines on LDS.org that are scripture, that have been in the stuff that Joseph Smith was revealed to him or translated, the Book of Mormon, Pearl of Great Price, etc. The first vision, multi-versions of it. The polygamy story here, you're learning it's much different than you're told in church. But when you just look at the scriptures, there are just ridiculous contradictions throughout the stuff that was all supposedly revealed by Jesus to Joseph Smith. And so I've cataloged what we actually have in the scriptures, because it's somehow easy to just forget what you've read and and not notice that it's a complete and total contradiction, which wouldn't happen with an all-knowing God. So it's very telling, and for you to give any credence to this, you have to say, well, Joseph Smith isn't what they told me he was. And then again, it's kind of like what Hiram Smith, said a few years back, not the original guy. Do you really believe that? Somebody told him, asked him when he mentioned the first vision story, that the story that everybody knows now. They didn't have that story in times of Joseph Smith. Evidently, he published that in 1842, but his family didn't know about it. And we got that on, the 10 or 9 versions of the first vision. But do you really believe that? Think of the things we believe. Now you wonder why these poor girls believe these stories, revelations, that Joseph Smith had a revelation they're going to be his wife for the night, or spiritual wife, that sort of a thing. You think, how could they be so credulous? But aren't we kind of the same thing? We've been conditioned to believe that that he's just this super righteous guy that God came down and visited. Like I said, his family never heard of that. The story has changed a lot, and the things that we believe we have to examine. And there is a lot of provable truth or falsehood that we can compare in the scriptures. God has his own laws, he says. Does he keep them? Is he consistent? Does he tell? So the channel button is just left of the subscription button. Hopefully you'll use them both and learn a lot. Most people don't have any idea how much Mormon doctrine has changed over the years. Jesus just keeps changing his mind. I mean, he's named the church 3 times, right? But a lot of doctrine has changed, and the reason people don't know about it is because the correlation department hides the older stuff. You don't see journal discourses on LDS.org, do you? In fact, do you see the documentary history of the church? No, you see correlated materials.